The night I found out it was raining. Not the soft, forgiving kind of rain that makes you want to curl up with tea and pretend the world is gentle. This was the kind that hammers windows like it has a grudge. The kind that drowns everything out. Which is probably why I didn't hear him come home. My name is Vivienne Cole, and until 11:47 on a Tuesday night in March, I believed I had a good life. Not a perfect life. Perfection is a lie people tell themselves when they're afraid to look closely at the cracks. But a good one. A real one. 14 years of marriage to a man I genuinely loved. A brownstone in the kind of neighborhood people wait years to move into. A career I'd built myself from nothing before I ever met him. I was a structural engineer. I understood how things were built to withstand pressure. I understood load-bearing walls. I understood better than most exactly what it took to hold something up. What I did not understand, not yet, was what happened when the entire foundation was a lie. I was in my home office when I heard the front door close too softly. That was the first sign. After 14 years, you know a person's sounds. The weight of their footsteps. The specific way they set their keys on the entry table. My husband, Raymond, had a way of coming home that announced itself. He was a man who filled a room, broad-shouldered and loud laughing, the kind of man who never tiptoed through anything. That night he tiptoed. I sat very still and listened to him move through the kitchen, heard the refrigerator open and close, heard him go upstairs without calling my name. He always called my name. Every single night for 14 years, even when we were in a fight, even when things were tense between us, he'd come home and say, "Viv," like he needed to confirm I was still there. That night, silence. I told myself he was tired. I told myself a lot of things in those next few minutes. I went back to the structural report on my screen. I highlighted a paragraph. I stared at it without reading a single word. Then my phone buzzed. The message was from a number I didn't recognize. 5 words and an attachment. "You deserve to know this." I should have paused. I should have thought about what I was about to open. But the thing about shock is that it moves faster than wisdom. I tapped the attachment before I'd even finished reading the message. It was a photograph. Raymond. In a restaurant I recognized, the one on Clement Street we used to go to for anniversaries, our restaurant, the one with the dark wood paneling and the single candle on every table. Sitting across from a woman I had never seen. His hand was covering hers. His face was tilted toward her in that way, that specific intimate way that a man only looks at a woman he has given himself to completely. She was beautiful. Younger than me, and her other hand rested on the small, unmistakable curve of a belly. I stared at that photograph for a very long time. Then I did something that surprised even me. I didn't cry. I didn't call him down from upstairs. I didn't send an angry reply to the unknown number. I opened a new folder on my desktop, titled it with that night's date, and I saved the photograph inside it. Because I was a structural engineer. And I knew something essential about cracked foundations. You don't start swinging a hammer the moment you find the damage. First you assess. You document. You understand exactly how deep the fracture goes before you decide what to do next. I didn't know yet how deep this one went, but I was about to find out. And what I would discover in the next 48 hours would make that photograph look like the very smallest piece of something enormous. Something that had been constructed deliberately around me, while I slept in my own house and believed in my own marriage. I closed my laptop. Turned off my desk lamp, and I started to plan. I did not confront Raymond the next morning. I made coffee. I poured him a cup. I kissed him on the cheek the way I always did, and I watched his face for any flicker of guilt, any hesitation, anything that cracked the surface. He smiled at me. He complained about traffic. He ate 2 pieces of toast, and left for work like it was any other Wednesday. That was the moment I understood the full scale of what I was dealing with. Because a guilty man flinches. A man who has made a mistake, who is carrying the ordinary weight of shame, can't quite meet your eyes. But Raymond looked at me the way he always had, easy, warm, comfortable in his own skin inside our home. And I realized that whatever he had built in the shadows, he had become very, very good at living in both worlds simultaneously. That required a different kind of response. I called in to work. Told my team I had a family emergency, which was not, technically, a lie. Then I sat down at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, and I began to write down everything I knew. The photograph. The restaurant. The pregnancy. The anonymous number that had sent it. That last item kept pulling at me. Someone wanted me to know. Someone had chosen this specific moment to tell me. The question wasn't just who, it was why now. Timing in a betrayal is never accidental. I'd learned that from years of forensic structural work. When something fails, it rarely fails without warning signs. The warning signs had simply been hidden from me. I hired a private investigator by noon. Vera Stanton. A woman in her mid-50s who had the unremarkable face of someone who could sit anywhere and be entirely invisible. She came highly recommended by a colleague whose divorce had been, by all accounts, formidably well documented. I told Vera what I had and what I needed. "How far do you want me to go?" she asked. "All the way," I said. "Every room. Every account. Every door." She looked at me for a moment with an expression that was neither sympathy nor judgment. Just professional assessment. "Most women who sit where you're sitting ask me to stop at the confirmation," she said. "They just want to know if it's real. You're telling me you want the whole structure." "I'm a structural engineer," I said. "I don't stop at the crack. I need to know what's holding it up." Vera nodded slowly. "Give me 72 hours. She gave me 48. And what she brought back rewrote 14 years of my life in a single afternoon. The woman's name was Dominique Hale, 29 years old. She had been with Raymond for 3 years, not 3 months, not 1 year, but 3 years, which meant this affair had begun when we were, by all outward measures, happiest. We had just renovated the brownstone. We had talked about children that year, briefly, carefully, the way couples talk about something they keep approaching and then retreating from. We had gone to Portugal that summer. I had photographs from that trip still on the wall of our hallway. She was 17 weeks pregnant. With twins. I read that line twice. Then I set down the folder Vera had given me and I looked out my kitchen window at the street below, and I thought, with the strange clinical calm that had settled over me like a second skin. Twins. But the pregnancy was not the worst thing in that folder. The worst thing was a document Vera had found through a contact she had inside Raymond's legal firm. A document that had been drafted 6 weeks ago. Before I had received any photograph. Before I had any knowledge of Dominique Hale, or her pregnancy, or the life Raymond had apparently been maintaining alongside our own. It was an agreement, prepared by Raymond's family lawyer. And it had my name on it. The document outlined terms of a settlement to be presented to me upon discovery of the affair. $25 million. In exchange for my signature on a divorce agreement that included a non-disclosure clause, a non-disparagement clause, and, buried in subsection 7, paragraph 3, a clause relinquishing any claim I might pursue related to Raymond's business holdings, including his stake in a real estate development company that, according to Vera's notes, was currently valued at somewhere in the range of $400 million. They had prepared this before I even knew, which meant they had known the discovery was coming, which meant someone had told them the photograph was being sent, which meant the anonymous message, the one I had assumed was from a concerned stranger or a guilty conscience, was something else entirely. It was an opening move. Someone had sent me that photograph not to warn me, but to start a clock. And Raymond and his lawyers were already positioned on the other side of it, waiting for me to walk through the door they had built. I sat with that understanding for a very long time. Then I picked up my phone and called Vera back. "The document," I said. "The settlement. I need to know who drafted it, and when the first version was created." A pause on her end. "Vivienne," she said carefully. "The first version was created 8 months ago." The line went quiet. My kitchen went quiet. The whole world seemed to hold its breath. "Then this was never about Dominique finding out she was pregnant," I said. "No," Vera said. "It wasn't." I asked the question I had been afraid to ask since I opened that folder. What is Raymond actually trying to protect? And what Vera told me next was the reason I would never sign that settlement. Not for $25 million. Not for any number they could possibly offer me. If you're still watching right now, you're exactly the kind of viewer I love. Subscribe so I can keep giving you stories that touch your heart. Hit that bell so you never miss what happens next. They called the meeting for a Thursday. Raymond's lawyer's office occupied the 43rd floor of a building downtown, the kind of office designed to communicate power before a single word was spoken. Floor-to-ceiling windows. A table long enough to suggest that the people on your side of it were simply outnumbered by the architecture. I had been in rooms like this before professionally. I had presented findings to boards and executives in spaces exactly like this one, and I had learned something important. The room is a performance. Don't perform back. Just watch. I arrived alone. I had not told Raymond I was coming. The expression on his face when I walked in was the most honest thing I had seen from him in 3 years. Pure, unguarded shock. He recovered fast. He was good at that. But for 1/2 second, Raymond Cole looked like a man whose carefully arranged world had just tilted sideways. His lawyer, A man named Fletcher, who had the overly smooth manner of someone who had spent decades making terrible things sound reasonable, gestured to the chair across from them. "Mrs. Cole," he said, "we appreciate you coming." "I didn't come because you called," I said pleasantly, setting my bag down and sitting. "I came because I had some questions." Fletcher glanced at Raymond. Raymond looked at the table. There were 3 of them on that side: Fletcher, a junior associate, and a woman I recognized from Vera's research as Raymond's financial advisor, Patricia Wynne. Patricia had the specific stillness of someone who was very good at not reacting to numbers that would make ordinary people faint. They walked me through the offer with a practiced efficiency that told me they had done this before. Not necessarily this exact offer, but this kind of conversation. The dissolution of a marriage as a business transaction. $25 million, structured in 3 tranches, the first of which would hit within 10 days of my signature. Non-disclosure. Non-disparagement. Clean and quiet and final. Fletcher slid the document across the table. A clean copy. My name already printed at the signature line. I did not touch it. "Raymond," I said, looking past Fletcher entirely. "Who owns the Verano Group?" The air in the room changed. Verano Group. The real estate development company that Vera had found buried inside Raymond's business holdings. The company that was not publicly listed. The company whose investors were structured through 3 separate LLCs that wound back, eventually, to a set of names that had made Vera pause before she'd even finished reading them to me. Raymond's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's not relevant to," Fletcher began. "Humor me," I said. Silence. The Verano Group, as Vera had uncovered it, was not simply a real estate company. It was a vehicle. Over the past 6 years, while I had been going to work and coming home and renovating our brownstone, and going to Portugal and building what I believed to be a shared life, Raymond had been quietly moving money. Not his money specifically. Money that had moved through accounts connected to our joint assets, our shared holdings, our home equity. Money that had, technically, originated in part from a business I had launched before we were married, the business I had sold during our marriage, the proceeds of which had gone into joint accounts we both controlled. In a community property framework, which our state observed, that made a portion of the Verano Group's value something that any competent attorney could argue was partially mine. Raymond had known this. His lawyers had known this. And the $25 million, a number designed to feel staggering, designed to make a woman feel taken care of, designed to make the alternatives feel like greed, was approximately 6% of what I could legitimately claim if I walked into a courtroom instead of signing that page. They had built a beautiful door. And they had done everything they could to make sure I walked through it before I noticed the room they were hiding behind it. I looked at Raymond across that long, architecturally imposing table, and I thought about Portugal. I thought about the photograph on our hallway wall. I thought about the conversation about children we'd had and retreated from, and I understood now, with a clarity that almost took my breath away, that he had retreated from it not because he was uncertain about fatherhood, but because he had already decided where his future children would be. "I'm not going to sign this," I said. Fletcher started talking. Raymond started talking. Patricia Wynne's carefully managed stillness developed the faintest tremor. I stood up, picked up my bag, and looked at my husband one last time. "I want you to know," I said quietly, "that I'm not angry. I'm not going to be loud about this. I'm not going to burn anything down." I paused. "But I came into this marriage with something, Raymond. And I built something. And you used it. So when my attorneys call yours next week, I need you to understand that the conversation is going to be very, very different from the one you planned." I walked out. In the elevator, alone, I finally let my hands shake. But here is what no one in that room knew. What Raymond's lawyers didn't know. What even Vera didn't know yet, because I hadn't told her. 3 days before that meeting, I had received a second message from the anonymous number. And this one hadn't contained a photograph. The second message arrived on a Sunday morning while I was drinking coffee on the steps of my brownstone, watching the neighborhood wake up around me. The Verano Group has a third partner. Raymond doesn't know I know. I can prove everything. Meet me. An address. A time. The following afternoon. I had spent 14 years being a careful person. Methodical. Evidence-based. The kind of woman who read the full contract before she signed it, who stress-tested her assumptions, who never walked into a structure without understanding the load it was carrying. Every instinct I had told me that meeting an anonymous source about my husband's hidden financial dealings while simultaneously navigating a discovery about his affair was not the careful, methodical thing to do. I went anyway. The address was a coffee shop in a neighborhood I rarely visited, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu and enough ambient noise that a conversation could happen without carrying. I arrived 10 minutes early, chose a seat with my back to the wall and a clear view of the door. Another thing I had learned from years of presenting findings to hostel rooms. And I waited. She walked in at exactly the agreed time. Dominique Hale. I had studied her face in photographs, seen the curve of her belly in the image that had started all of this. But photographs do not prepare you for the reality of a person, and the reality of Dominique Hale was this. She was frightened. Not of me, though she had reason to be. Frightened in a deeper, more systemic way. The kind of fear that comes from understanding you are inside something much larger than you realized. She sat down across from me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I sent you the first photograph, she said. I know, I said. I didn't send it because I wanted to hurt you. She looked at her hands. I sent it because they told me you already knew. They told me the divorce was already filed. They told me I was waiting for a process that was already in motion. She paused. I found out that was a lie about a month ago. I watched her carefully. What else did they lie to you about? The story she told me over the next hour rearranged everything I thought I understood. Dominique had met Raymond 3 years ago at an industry event. She was an accountant at a firm that did contract work for several of Raymond's business interests. Their relationship had developed the way these things do, gradually, then suddenly. She had believed, she said, that he was separated. He had told her the marriage was effectively over, that the legal process was slow, that he was simply waiting for the right moment to make things formal. Classic. Devastating. And so ordinary in its cruelty that it almost hurt to hear it. But what Dominique had access to, as a professional who worked adjacent to his financial structures, was information. She wasn't a forensic accountant. She hadn't been looking for irregularities. But she was trained, and eventually, when she started asking questions about her own future, about security, about what the life Raymond was describing to her would actually look like, she had started to see things. The third partner in the Verano group was not a business associate. It was a shell company. And the shell company traced back to a series of transactions that, if Dominique's accounting instincts were right, constituted a pattern that was not simply aggressive financial planning. It was fraud. Not marital fraud. Not the kind of infidelity and financial maneuvering I had already uncovered. Something categorically different. Something that involved investors. Something that involved regulatory exposure. Something that, if it came to light in the wrong way, would not simply unwind Raymond's business empire. It would dismantle it entirely and potentially result in consequences that no settlement agreement and no NDA could protect against. The $25 million they had offered me was not just an attempt to protect Raymond's assets from a divorce claim. It was an attempt to buy my silence before I stumbled onto something that made the divorce the least of his problems. I sat back in my chair and looked at Dominique Hale, pregnant with twins alone, having come to me not out of spite, but out of a dawning and desperate realization that she, too, was sitting on top of a structure that had been built to collapse, and that she would go down with it if she didn't find a way out. Why come to me? I asked. She met my eyes. Because you're the only one in this whole situation who doesn't need anything from him, she said. You're the only one who could walk away with nothing and still be okay. I thought about that for a moment. I'm not going to walk away with nothing, I said. I know, she said. That's why I came to you. I asked her if she had documentation. She had documentation. I asked her if she was willing to cooperate with an attorney and potentially a regulatory inquiry. She closed her eyes for a moment, and I watched her make the kind of decision that costs something, the kind that you make in your chest before your brain catches up with it. She said yes. I paid for the coffee. We walked out into the afternoon and went in separate directions. I did not look back. But what I did next, what I set in motion in the following 72 hours, was something that Raymond and Fletcher and Patricia Wynne and everyone who had sat across that long table from me had never considered possible. Because they had made a fundamental error. The same error that almost every person makes when they underestimate someone who has spent their entire career understanding how things hold together. They thought my goal was to win the divorce. 11 weeks after I walked out of Fletcher's office, Raymond Cole's attorneys called mine with a revised offer. I did not take that call. My attorney did. And she called me afterward with a number that she repeated twice because she thought I might not have heard her correctly. I had heard her correctly. I want to tell you what happened in those 11 weeks because it did not look, from the outside, like anything dramatic. I did not make scenes. I did not go to the press. I did not call anyone and tell them what I knew. I went to work. I came home to the brownstone, which Raymond had vacated without needing to be asked. And I sat in my kitchen in the evenings and I built, quietly and methodically, the most careful case of my professional life. Except this time the structure I was documenting wasn't a bridge or a building. It was a fraud. My attorney, a woman named Adiz Obi, who had the particular combination of intelligence and stillness that made opposing counsel consistently underestimate her, connected with two forensic accountants who worked through Dominique's documentation alongside Vera's findings. What emerged over the course of 6 weeks was a complete picture of what the Verano Group had actually been, a vehicle for diverting investor funds through a series of transactions that were obscured by the shell company structure, laundered through legitimate development costs and backstopped partially by assets that had moved through our joint accounts during our marriage. The exposure was not just civil. It was potentially criminal. When Adiz first laid the full picture out for me across her conference table, a smaller, quieter table than Fletcher's, in an office without a view designed to intimidate, she looked at me steadily and asked what I wanted. I had thought about this question for weeks. I had thought about it on the steps of my brownstone and in my office, and in the evenings when the house was quiet, and I was alone with 14 years of memory and a yellow legal pad full of documented betrayal. I want 3 things, I said. The first thing, a divorce settlement that reflected my actual legal claim, including the Verano Group assets, which Adiz's team had calculated at a fair share value of approximately $62 million. The second thing, no NDA. Not for me. I wasn't going to the press. I wasn't going to write a book or give interviews or perform my pain for anyone. But I was not going to be contractually forbidden from speaking about my own marriage and my own life, and I was not going to sign a document that treated my silence as a commodity to be purchased. The third thing was the one that surprised Adiz. I want Dominique Hale to be represented, I said. Separately. By her own attorney. And I want any settlement structure to account for the fact that she has 2 children coming into this situation who had no part in any of it. Adiz looked at me for a long moment. You understand, she said carefully, that what you're describing means advocating, at least indirectly, for the woman who... I understand what I'm describing, I said. She nodded slowly. Okay. What followed was 6 weeks of negotiation that I will not pretend was clean or easy or without moments where I sat in my car outside Adiz's office building and breathed very carefully until the wave of something, grief, fury, exhaustion, all of it tangled together, passed enough that I could go back in and keep going. Raymond's camp, once they understood the full scope of what we had documented, shifted from aggressive to careful almost overnight. The Verano Group's exposure was something they could not afford to have become public in the context of a contested, high-profile divorce. The investor relationships alone, the regulatory implications. Fletcher, who had slid that clean settlement document across the table to me with such practiced ease, stopped talking and started listening. The final settlement was $68 million. Not 62. Because by the time we reached agreement, Adiz had found 2 additional asset classifications that should have been in the initial calculation, and because Raymond's attorneys, at a certain point, simply wanted it over. I did not sign an NDA. I signed a settlement. There is a difference. And the clause I insisted on, the one that established a separate, structured financial provision for Dominique's children, funded by Raymond and documented in the agreement, was the clause that Fletcher had pushed back on hardest and that I had refused in 3 separate negotiation sessions to remove. Because I was clear about something, and I had been clear about it since that Sunday afternoon in the coffee shop with the chalkboard menu and the mismatched chairs. Dominique Hale had been lied to, systematically and deliberately. She had believed things that were not true, trusted a person who had engineered her trust for his own purposes, and was now carrying 2 children into a situation that she had not fully understood she was entering. She was not blameless. I was not pretending she was blameless. But those children were entirely innocent, and the idea of them entering the world already disadvantaged by the choices of the man who was supposed to protect them was not something I was willing to be complicit in through inaction. I had the leverage. I used it for something that mattered. The divorce was finalized on a Wednesday in late June. I signed the papers in Adiz's office, and she poured us both a small glass of something that tasted expensive, and we sat quietly for a moment in the way that people do when something large has finally ended. You know, Adiz said, in 15 years of doing this, I have never seen a petitioner use their position to secure provisions for the other woman. She wasn't the other woman, I said. She was another victim. There's a difference. Adiz considered that. Not many people would see it that way. Not many people are structural engineers, I said. We're trained to look at the whole system, not just the part that's failing. I drove home through streets I had lived on for 14 years, past the brownstone which I had decided to sell, not because I couldn't afford to keep it, not because the memories were unbearable, but because I understood at a structural level that some foundations cannot be repaired. Some buildings, once compromised, are better demolished and rebuilt from the ground up. I had already found an apartment. Smaller. Different neighborhood. Walls I had never shared with anyone. I had already started preliminary conversations about a new firm, a structural engineering consultancy, my own, the kind I had always thought about starting, and had always deferred for reasons I understood now, in hindsight, were partly about accommodation. Making myself smaller so that the shape of my life would fit more neatly around someone else's. I was done being smaller. There is a thing that happens when you discover that everything you believed about your life was constructed around a deception. A kind of gravity. It wants to pull you down into the story of what was done to you, make you a permanent resident of that narrative, make the betrayal the defining fact of your existence. I had watched it happen to people I knew. The way a wound can become an identity if you let it. I did not intend to let it. What Raymond had done to me was real. The grief was real. I want to be honest about that, because two clean stories that skip the grief are their own kind of lie. There were nights in those 11 weeks when the loss of what I had believed I had was a physical weight, something I carried from room to room and set down only when I was too tired to hold it anymore. But grief and identity are not the same thing. I had learned in 14 years of building that the material that comes through the fire is often stronger than what went in. Dominique's twins were born in August. 2 girls. She sent me a photograph, not an anonymous one this time, a real one, with her name attached and a message that was 3 sentences long and said more than 3 sentences usually can. I looked at that photograph for a long time. 2 small faces, brand new, entirely unaware of the complicated world they had arrived in. I saved the photograph. Not in a folder of documentation this time. Somewhere else. My new firm opened its doors in September. I hired 3 people I respected enormously and one intern who reminded me of myself at 23, methodical, hungry, and deeply uninterested in pretending that cracks don't exist. The first project we took on was a bridge assessment in a city 3 states away. A structure that had been declared sound by 2 previous engineering firms, but that a local advocacy group, largely women who had grown up near it, insisted had problems that no one was taking seriously. They were right. We found 4 significant issues in the first assessment. Issues that, left unaddressed, would have led, not dramatically or suddenly but inevitably, to a failure that would have been called an accident by everyone except the people who had known and looked away. I wrote the report myself. I documented everything. I recommended not a patch, not a repair that would extend the life of a compromised structure by a few years. I recommended rebuilding. From the ground up. With better materials. Better oversight. And this time, foundations that could actually hold what was being placed on top of them. When the city council approved the project, I sat in that meeting room and listened to them read the recommendation into the public record, and I thought about a yellow legal pad. About a folder on a desktop. About a woman in a coffee shop with her hands on a table and a decision being made in her chest. I thought about what it means to assess something honestly. To look at the full system. To resist the pressure to sign on the line and walk away with enough to be comfortable while the real problem remains, unaddressed, waiting to take down the next person who trusts it. Some structures cannot be saved. Some need to be rebuilt entirely. I know how to do that now. In ways I never expected to learn, from a teacher I never asked for, in a year that broke everything I thought I'd built. I finally know exactly how strong I am.